Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Simon Lichter, Director of Scholar Circle, a program of Chai Mitzvah. This lecture is part of Antizionism, the History of an Ideology, a special six-part series hosted by Chai Mitzvah. The series examines the historical origins, evolution, and contemporary manifestations of Antizionism. The series is sponsored by the Institute for the Critical Study of Antizionism. Today's scholar topic is part one, the Great Lethal Projection, Anti-Zionism's Debt to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, with Professor Richard Landis. Chai Mitzvah is a national organization, now celebrating its 17th year. We are the host of Scholar Circle and a Jewish resource center that focuses on building community through Jewish engagement programs. Scholar Circle has engaged over 4,000 participants since 10/7. We have over 20 curricula tailored for small group conversation for teens and adults, lay or professional led. For more information, please visit our website at highmitzvah.org. The Scholars Circle program was inspired by Scott Shea, our founder and board president, who authored the best-selling book, Conspiracy U, a Case Study, which unpacks anti-Zionist conspiracy theories from the left and the right of the political spectrum. The curriculum was also taught in a recorded series by Professor Andrew Pessin. The Scholar Circle program hosts lectures by prominent scholars every 2 weeks on topics relating to Israel and the Jewish community, geared towards rabbis, educators, and lay leaders who are charged with explaining the complex issues the Jewish community is facing. To that end, each lecture will have a resource guide that will be sent to you after the lecture. A recording of each lecture will be accessible on our website and shared with you through email as well. We welcome audience questions anytime. Please use the Zoom's Q&A box. Please welcome Professor Andrew Pessin to introduce our esteemed scholar. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. And let me start by thanking Chai Mitzvah Scholar Circle. These folks have been doing fantastic work for a long time, but especially since October 7th, they really stepped to the plate, bringing in all sorts of scholars to discuss and analyze and motivate the Jewish community and the Zionist community. So thank you to them for sponsoring this wonderful series. Please, everybody, give them a few dollars, find their donation page and just send them a few dollars. I'm thrilled to announce the launch of the Institute for the Critical Study of Anti-Zionism. This is a new scholarly initiative to produce, promote, and disseminate critical scholarship on the history, evolution, and contemporary manifestations of anti-Zionism. Happily, we're off to a terrific start. We have over 100 scholars already on the roster, with more coming in every day. We have 3,000 followers and subscribers to the Substack, so please check us out at the website is icsaz.org, icsaz.org. The free Substack is at icsa.substack.com. And I am absolutely thrilled and honored to have Professor Landis give the inaugural lecture in our inaugural six-part webinar series, Anti-Zionism, the History of an Ideology. I have a conventional biography I could read, but let me just say Richard Landis is a brilliant scholar who saw, sorry to embarrass you, who saw before anybody else did what was going on campuses in the West, in the encroachment of a really dangerous ideology. He has fantastic credentials from Harvard and Princeton. He is the author of many books and articles, including an edited volume on the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which will be the topic for today's talk. And most importantly, I think one of the most important books of the 21st century, published just a couple of years ago, Can the Whole World Be Wrong? Lethal Journalism, Anti-Semitism, and Global Jihad. I was privileged to be able to write a review of that for the Tel Aviv Review of Books. It's a very, very important book. I think everybody needs to read it, so please do check that out. As Simon mentioned, there'll be time for questions at the end. Professor Landis will speak for about 30 minutes. Please put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom. And so with no further ado, I introduce to you Professor Richard Landis.
Thank you, Andrew. Before I begin, I'd like to thank you, Andrew, for this opportunity to contribute to the founding of a new field of study, critical anti-Zionism studies. In part, this reflects and acknowledges the fact that the effort to subsume anti-Zionism as the new anti-Semitism hasn't worked. The current public sphere is filled with people who conflate the anti-Zionist invective with legitimate criticism of Israel and of anyone who supports her. So calling them anti-Semites just rolls right off their backs. Indeed, a whole academic field of scientific study, a whole academic field of anti-Zionist studies has arisen in close parallel to the scientific field of anti-Semitism studies in German academia in the late 19th and early 20th century. Anti-Zionism makes its own unique contribution to the world's longest hatred and needs to be treated as the autonomous phenomenon that it has become in the 21st century, every bit its own and new version of the 4 millennia-old phenomenon of Judeophobia. Indeed, it stands out amongst all previous avatars by its patent self-destructive folly, and as such, it raises a whole new range of scholarly questions. I want to give you, Andrew, and all of those who plow and will plow these fields of knowledge, the following blessing. May the institutions of higher learning that emerge from the current war between Islamic triumphalism and Western democracies be committed to the kind of intellectual integrity that values critical anti-Zionism studies for its contribution to human freedom. May they include this field in their curricula for the new millennium. In pursuit of that new and most useful knowledge, I'd like to focus on what I think is a key dimension of all Judeophobia, but in its current anti-Zionist form offers some remarkably new and revealing characteristics. A study of the role of collective Gentile projection onto Jews. Let me begin with perhaps the single most revealing document concerning this collective projection, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Around the turn of the 19th century, agents for various monarchical regimes and their aristocracies forged a document which purported to be the official protocols of a secret meeting of rabbis, the Elders of Zion, at the First Zionist Conference in Basel in 1897. The almost comically fraudulent nature of the document struck even those for whom it was intended, most famously the Tsar himself, as absurd. Much of the liberal response has been to prove the forgery and denounce it, to bemoan its seemingly inextinguishable appeal. Here, I'd like to approach the document as a projection, namely the product of non-Jews imagining what Jews think. And the voice that is, through this projective ventriloquism, placed in the mouth of the rabbis by the protocols, is an eerily familiar one in Western literature. It is the voice of power politics, a voice that does not appear in Jewish sources, but does repeatedly over the millennia in Gentile sources, even the allegedly democratic Greeks. Quote, "It is a law long before us and will be long after us, that those who can do what they will, and those who cannot suffer what they must." Call it the dominating imperative, rule or be ruled. If I don't establish my rule over you, you'll do it to me. Or, as the Athenians said to the Melians, you only complain about fairness because you're weak. If you were strong, you'd do the same thing to us as we now do to you. These relentlessly zero-sum paranoid political principles have shaped international and domestic politics for the longue durée of the last 10 millennia. The everyday version of this imperative is do unto others before they do unto you. Again, a hard zero-sum attitude. I can only win if you lose. If you even win a little positive sum, I lose. In any case, I assume the worst of my neighbor. In its apocalyptic version, however, the dominating imperative becomes the genocidal paranoid imperative. Exterminate or be exterminated. The Protocols reads as an amalgam of Plato and Machiavelli. Everyone knows, as Plato taught, that democracy is a recipe for anarchy and then tyranny. So, the Machiavellian reasons, the only reason the Jews could be pushing democracy was to create an anarchy in which they could become global tyrants. This view accorded with an accurate observation. Everywhere there was liberal activity in the 18th and 19th centuries, newspapers, arts, markets, academia, revolutions, there were assimilated Jews energetically participating. That must then be part of a great plan to dupe the masses into throwing off their natural rulers, i.e., the Gentile aristocracy, thus making all of them easy victims of the Jews' plan for mass global enslavement. As such, it lays out a demopathic blueprint for the first time, and demopathy is the word I'm going to use. It means invoking liberal principles to destroy democracies, appeal to people's senses of fairness and freedom to trick them into losing their freedom. This demopathy is a distinct Gentile strategy which we will meet repeatedly anon. In the protocols, the projection involved knows no bounds. It becomes what clinical psychologists call psychotic projection, which involves, quote, a complete break from reality, where projected delusional thoughts are experienced as absolute external truths. The protocols attributes the most heinous and grandiose ambitions to the Jews. They hate all mankind, whose utter enslavement they gleefully plot. They are the worst, most deplorable, loathsome, and, above all, dangerous people on the planet. Understood as a projection, as a self-description, this text offers us insight into the fevered world of a paranoid Gentile aristocracy of the day, limbic malevolence at its worst. Anyone driven by this dominating imperative obviously does not want the rest of the world to know what they're thinking. They can't allow their lust for power to become what Steven Pinker calls common knowledge. Everyone on the inside, here the Gentile aristocracy, knows that jungle rules apply, but deny it in public. It's for their own good that we rule over the masses. Under normal conditions of aristocratic dominance that prevailed for millennia, the public secret was relatively safe. But now, under modernity's triumphal fin de siècle, with an increasingly free public sphere, this previously dominant elite felt an existential insecurity, a mortal threat that led them to project the most heinous version of their own predatory mentality onto the Jews, thereby justifying their own genocidal hatreds. In this psychotic form, the projection demanded urgent action against this heinous enemy, the great lethal projection. To paraphrase Thucydides' Athenians, the strong exterminate, the weak suffer extermination. Which brings us to the most remarkable aspect of this lethal projection. It bespeaks a great fear of the Jews, an almost awestruck appreciation of their covert power, of their extensive worldwide influence. This attitude towards Jews contrasted significantly with the mainstream consensus amongst liberal Westerners who congratulated themselves on discovering democratic principles all on their own. Open paren, Western political thought begins with Greeks, not the Hebrew Bible, and viewed the participation of the Jews in democratic society as a generous favor they were doing for a needy cousin. The paranoids, on the other hand, attributed a central role to Moses' teaching and noted with alarm Jewish participation in the flourishing of their great and growing enemy, democracy. Around 1800, after two egalitarian revolutions, French and American, or American and French to be chronological, the paranoid aristocracy thought the Masons were the drivers of global democratic conspiracy against their rule. After a century of democratization and Jewish emancipation, the paranoids of 1900, that's the time of the protocols, identified the Jews as the real power behind the scenes. The Masons, Nietzsche, Darwin were all duped puppets. It's as if the authors of the forgery said to themselves, If we had the power these Jews have, we would engage in this conspiracy to enslave the world. Here is the central point about the projection. Those who believe in the protocols tell us something very disturbing about themselves. In the following sections, I'll give a brief summary of the role of the protocols played in Nazi and Arab culture. More detail available in the longer version of this available at Andrew and my Substacks, and more detail coming in future lectures. The Nazis. The Nazis didn't use the protocols in their official statements, and German anti-Semitism scholars did not cite it. It was too obviously and internationally known as a fake. But they embraced the great lethal projection of their own designs and desires onto their targeted enemy, the Jews. For Hitler, the text literally embodied the Nazi philosophy. The systematic and relentless drive for raw, untrammeled power on the global scene, enslavement of the inferior races. As Daniel Pipes pointed out 40 years ago in his book on conspiracy, part of the appeal of the protocols amongst Germans was not just with anti-Semitism, but with a fascination in learning from the Jews how to extend German power. The memes of the protocols were thus everywhere in Nazi propaganda. The plotting, dastardly, malevolent Jew, enemy of mankind who controls the media and the markets, who destroys Gentile youth with alcohol, who gets Gentiles to fight their wars for them, who plots the genocide of the Germans, the should-be master race. Among a population eager for scapegoats in a time of crisis, Nazis raised up the worst angels of their people's nature and created an image of the Jew so hateful and terrifying that they successfully turned German society as a whole, actively or passively, to the systematic, technologically cutting-edge undertaking of exterminating their Jews. The protocols as a warrant for genocide. The German people had allowed themselves to be duped by paranoid maniacs into a terrible course of action, which, within a matter of years, led to the death of some 80 million people worldwide, the vast majority of whom were civilians, including over 12 million German dead. The great lethal projection fueled a genocide of those upon whom it had been projected, and megadeath among those who believed it. I repeat, those who believe the protocols tell us some very disturbing things about themselves. The Arabs and Palestinianism. Over the course of the last century, since the protocols were first translated into Arabic in the mid-1920s, the text has become an object of faith in Arab and Muslim culture. The claims of forgery posed no problem to Arab intellectuals who swept them aside, as had the Nazis, by claiming the text spoke of a higher truth. It is part of their canon of true texts, which they believe the Jews both wrote and held dear. In 2002, the Alexandrian Library, in a UNESCO-sponsored exhibit on world religions, placed the protocols along a Torah scroll in a display of Jewish sacred texts. That Ramadan, Egyptian TV ran lurid reenactments of the protocols and the blood libels. Moreover, the text first entered the public sphere in the later 1920s, right after the Axis powers, those very democracies that the Jews had created according to the protocols, had dismantled the Ottoman Caliphate in 1924. Islam's claim to dominion over Dar al-Islam was annulled. Triumphalist Muslims expressed their shock at what they called the Nakba, this catastrophe that modern times had inflicted on Islam. The protocols offered a perfect explanation for their current disarray. The Zionists had orchestrated this Nakba, this catastrophe. They were the tip of the spear aimed at the heart of Islam, aimed at the heart of their triumphalist Islam. The triumphalist Muslim response to this threat to their hegemony, as with their perception of an Armenian threat only decades earlier, was genocidal. In 1937, at the height of the Arab revolt in British Mandate Palestine, Haj Amin al-Husseini published a, quote, fatwa of the Grand Mufti to the Islamic world, unquote. In it, he depicted, in much the style of the protocols, the inherently dishonest, scheming, malevolent nature of the Jews whose power was becoming alarmingly great. He concluded by citing verbatim a genocidal hadith that had, until then, lain largely dormant in the Muslim world. The last hour will not come until the Muslims fight against the Jews and the Muslims kill them, until the Jews hide themselves between a rock or a tree, and the rocks and the trees call out, "O Muslim, O servant of Allah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him." Nature itself loathes the Jews. Starting in the year 1400 Annus Hejira, namely 1979 Common Era, jihad took a new turn. No longer defensive efforts to restore the caliphate, some triumphalist Muslims called for a worldwide jihad to establish a global caliphate, a call that came from both Sunni and Shi'i jihadis, bin Laden and Khomeini. And both schools of global jihad consider this genocidal hadith about Jews a precondition to their ultimate, their apocalyptic victory. Its principles, both the genocidal hadith and the protocols, are enshrined in Hamas's charter of 1988. No one today, no one seriously contests either the genocidal hadith or the protocols in the Muslim public sphere, both in Muslim majority countries and among preachers and apologists in the Western diaspora. There is perhaps no more toxic, no more transparent projection than this. I repeat, those who believe the protocols tell us some very disturbing things about themselves. The Western left. But what about the anti-Zionist left that insists it maintains progressive principles and has allegedly high standards of analysis and deconstruction? How can they fail to see the toxic nature of the hatred thus projected and the danger of adopting that projection as formulated by their enemies, the most ferocious imperialists on the planet, the caliphate or jihadis? Instead, an entire academic industry has arisen, proving, documenting, endlessly reformulating the great lethal projection in secular, theoretical, and empirical terms. Rather than challenge the caliphate or demopathic discourse about a struggle for human rights and their depiction of the enemy, their enemy, Israel, as the embodiment of their own ruthless genocidal power politics, these scholars, these anti-Zionist scholars, amplify it. At the heart of this post-colonial anti-Zionist scholarship, we find an unshakable commitment to the great lethal projection. The legacy media and their attraction to lethal journalism offers yet another example. Indeed, a generation of Western information professionals has adopted the demopathic caliphate or appeal to progressive values of freedom, justice, resistance to empire. They thereby partake, willingly or unwittingly, in the great lethal projection itself and its goals of exterminating the Jews and establishing a Muslim world empire. One might have thought that the events of October 7th offered a powerful opportunity for the progressive left to awaken, to see the wolf's teeth rather than grandma's nightgown. For me, it was 2000. Witnessing the Gazans' raw and terrifyingly intentional display of sadistic genocidal rage, planned and proudly posted online, and noting the widespread justification and praise by allegedly nonviolent Palestinian and Muslim human rights groups, one might have thought that in parallel with October 8th Jews, there would be October 8th liberals who finally awakened to the noxious nature of the great lethal projection. And yet, no. The progressive left came out aggressively in support of Hamas, the heroic resistance movement. University presidents and administrations stood by while caliphators led their dupes in chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine will be Arab, and globalized the intifada that Hamas had just started. It's hard to imagine a more horrifying collapse of the lines of moral and intelligent decency and self-preservation upon which all civil societies are founded and depend. Over the last 2 years, the world has been inundated with images of war-related Palestinian suffering. Many of these images come from Palestinian cameramen who weaponize them to accuse Israel of everything that Palestinians do and want to do. And they are dutifully distributed by social media and legacy news agencies who speak rarely of the endless pre-strike warnings provided by the IDF to civilians and the open insistence of Hamas that Gazans are and should be human shields. And so, just as Hamas leaders triumphantly declare, the West is filled with a flood of their propaganda, their great lethal projection, Israeli genocide with its corollaries, deliberate mass famine, targeting hospitals, killing babies, etc., etc. Nothing could be more ludicrous than broadcasts like CNN's Jeremy Diamond on the terrible Gaza famine, just as Gazan restaurateurs tweet out their plentiful wares and their fat, thronging customers. By 2026, accusing Israel of genocide has become something of a red badge of courage for those belonging to the progressive camp. Joy Reid recently proclaimed to applause, quote, I do not think that a Democratic candidate can be elected unless they acknowledge that there's a genocide in Gaza. Refusal makes you unelectable. In other words, the democratic majority that these Palestinianists want to see is one that limits its candidates to those who adopt Hamas's lethal projection as real-world truth. Palestinianists today are walking, talking fools, dupes by principle of the caliphate or projection. Susan Sarandon, Mark Ruffalo, Oliver Stone, and so many others who wear keffiyehs, who use the G word freely, who defend Francesca Albanese's delirious rants and rally to the side of terrorists like Marwan Barghouti. And they think thereby they show their moral bona fides. Et tu, Benedicte Cumberbatch? Et tu, Mandy Patinkin? Could caliphators ask Allah for more compliant victims, for even more useful infidels? Well, yes. Now that the right wing is catching the brain virus, Tucker Carlson, Candace Owen, Nick Fuentes, but for the right wing, this is a no-brainer. Like Hitler, they embrace power politics and freely wield the great lethal protection. The conspiracist tale of leftist Palestinians, on the other hand, the tale that they swallow and regurgitate, marries the most destructive of luxury beliefs with suicidal virtue signaling, harming Palestinians and Israelis oh so far away while strutting one's moral credentials on the world stage. And the caliphators, who benefit immensely from this suicidal strutting, have nothing but contempt for their legions of useful progressive infidels. I repeat, those who believe in the protocols tell us some very disturbing things about themselves. Unlike the Germans of the 1930s or the Western communists of the 1920s to 50s, the current round of destructive projection enablers are being duped by caliphators who are open purveyors of every hateful bias these progressives claim to despise. Misogyny, homophobia, imperialism, racism, apartheid, inquisitorial religious supremacism. The wolf wears no mask. So who are these shepherds who lead us to destruction? The accusation of Israeli genocide, which the left now considers a shibboleth of belonging to the party of good people, is indeed a litmus test. Those who believe in it and repeat it tell us that they are dupes to a malevolent deception. They bear witness to their own radical moral disorientation. They've completely ingested the apocalyptic narrative of an alien invasive species of thought, what Godsad calls a brain virus. Caliphators cannot ask for a more complete victory. It is the functional equivalent of the Trojans, convinced that they should breach their walls and take the Greek horse into their city. As such, anti-Zionism embodies open levels of self-destructiveness greater than any previous form of Judeophobia. And in this sense, the critical study of anti-Zionism as a field can contribute a new range of questions to the mysteries of the longest hateful fear. Today, Western, infidel, anti-Zionists, Palestinianists are attacking Jews in order to allow a merciless enemy to invade their progressive societies and hijack their institutions, academia, UN, NGOs, legacy media, world courts. This current form of Judeophobia then offers a new and virulent strain in which the openly self-destructive quality is more obvious than ever before. Is this done willingly or unwittingly? Consciously or unconsciously? I imagine there's a large spectrum between complete denial, let's call them the John Lennon imagine anti-Zionists, and open enthusiasm like Professor Russell Rickford expressed on October 8th, cheering on Hamas. Normally, however, projection works at least to the superficial service of the self. Here, Palestinians adopt a projection that works in the service of an enemy to all they claim to be sacred, a marriage of Judeophobia and Freud's death instinct. What lies at the heart of this self-harming? Beneath how many layers of denial lies the acknowledgement of the alien hostile rejection? What role does self-loathing play both among Palestinianists and their Jewish allies? What dark and unavowable sadomasochistic desires lurk behind this thrall to something so vile as the Great Lethal Projection? Sadism on the right, masochism on the left? What explains the attraction among Western progressives to a right-wing cult of death like Hamas? It appears that whether those with this anti-Zionist brain virus act in the same way that the German people did in accepting Hitler's projections. And like the German folk, they join the predators in targeting a scapegoat prey. Only this time, adopting caliphate or anti-Zionism, they themselves as infidels are also the scapegoat prey. Let me suggest a place to start. Make it your litmus test of intellectual integrity and seriousness that anyone who thinks that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza indicates thereby they have a brain virus acquired from a hostile other. They are not to be trusted. They are not to be taken seriously. Such a decision would mark an important turn towards a sane demotic conversation in the public sphere. It would be as if Laocoon's party had won and the Trojans had left the Greek horse and the warriors inside it to bake on the Aegean beach. To say no to the poison propaganda, caliphate or demopathy, anti-Zionism studies, lethal journalism, NGO-Palestinianism, but rather identify them as such, critical anti-Zionism studies. With due acknowledgement of the inevitable suffering of Gazans during a war started by their leaders and cheered in their streets, we must find a way to say to the Arab Muslim world and their democratic spokesman, we cannot tell you what to think, but you cannot stop us from judging what you say and claim according to our standards of moral and intellectual integrity. And you certainly cannot expect us either to join your debilitating discourse or take seriously those who do. Over and out. Thank you.
All right. 1 second, start video. We'll be right there. There we go.
30 minutes.
Am I visible?
Yep.
Thank you, Professor Landis. That was really spectacular. I personally found that very, very chilling and upsetting on so many levels. I should mention, as you mentioned in passing, that a longer written version of this talk will be available in the near future on the Institute for the Critical Study of Anti-Zionism Substack, as well as on Professor Landis' Substack. So please do subscribe at ixa.substack.com to get the longer written version of this talk. And I know that there is a donation button for Chai Mitzvah Scholar Circle was put into the chat, so please do check that out. There are a load of questions, not surprisingly, with a talk like that. Let me actually begin with a question a very bright student of mine just asked the other day, which I think is completely relevant. Given the theme of tonight's talk, which is the sort of foundational role that the protocols of the Elders of Zion play in anti-Zionism, starting with you addressed the Nazis and the Arab Muslims and then the Western progressives. How do you explain the fact that if that Western progressives, the large majority of them, certainly the people on our campuses, the student activists, etc., won't ever have heard of the protocols? They almost certainly haven't read it. And if they were aware of it, they would disavow it because it's a standard text of sort of right-wing anti-Semitism. So how can you explain how they manifest the influence of this text despite not having heard of it, not having read it, and possibly disavowing it? And the student also added to that, I guess the hypothesis, is there a role that legacy media somehow plays in that transmission?
Well, yes. I mean, a little background. I first ran across the protocols when my wife was teaching at the University of California, Berkeley in 1982. And there was the Sabra and Shatila massacres, and the anti-Zionists were out in force. This is back in 1982. And the Iranian students were handing out sort of excerpts from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So a couple of years later, when I was at Columbia as a Hayman Fellow, we taught Western moral and political thought. And when we got to totalitarianism, I had to dig up, and it was hard to get, a copy of the protocols and assign it to my students. And I didn't tell them what it was. And when they read it, they came into class, it's 1985, and said, "What is this crazy document?" So it was clear to them it was crazy. But what I realized was that the memes from the protocols, the Jews control the press, the Jews control the markets, the Jews are manipulating everybody. These memes are constantly being fed into the body politic. And as a result, the willingness of the mainstream news media to adopt a narrative from the Palestinians disguised as a liberation narrative, but which carries all of this projected malice in it, has made it possible for these students on campus to literally, their mental systems are running protocols memes and they don't even know it. They don't know the protocols. They don't know the history of the protocols. I don't know, I suggested at the time, and I remember going to a number of professors at Columbia, including Fritz Stern, who is a historian of modern Germany, and saying we need an edition of the protocols so people can understand what's going on. And he said, no, 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 let sleeping dogs lie. You think that you are inoculating people, but in fact, you'll be infecting them. And, within a decade, the internet was up and running and the text was available to everyone.
My own experience is, when I teach this material, including the protocols, I do worry students read it, they start to become convinced by it. And
right.
what's fascinating, I know, looking historically at the role of the protocols, as you said, it was established early on, proven pretty conclusively that it was a forgery, a plagiarism and all that sort of stuff. But so many people, starting with the Nazis, Hitler onward, said, "Oh, it doesn't really matter. It's still true, right?
Doesn't
Even
matter.
if the actual source of the text." So there's this deep
Higher
desire
truth.
to believe in the themes of this thing, whether or
Right.
not the text itself is true, which tells you there's something beyond the text that's preparing people for that.
Yeah.
Um, there was a question, since you focused on the Nazis, the Muslim Arabs, and the progressives, why you left out the Soviets. I think I can answer that, but other members of this series are going to address the Soviets in greater
Right.
detail, so
Right.
no need for you to have done that.
Well,
We have a
yeah,
question.
I did have a section on Lenin. I mean, one of the things about Lenin is he didn't go for the protocols because it was published by his enemies in the Tsarist secret police, the Okhrana.
Right,
So he wasn't an enthusiast, but he was an enthusiast of um, conspiracy theory, of the projection of conspiracy. He was a conspiracist, and he never tired of accusing the capitalists, who we all know were run by the Jews, of being conspiracists. And Dan Pipes in the book, it's a really good book, Conspiracy. Pipes points out that, when he took over, when the Bolsheviks took over Russia, it was the first time that a paranoid conspiracist group had taken power. And the consequences were disastrous for the Soviet Union. Black Book of Communism thinks that somewhere between 60 to 80,000, 80 million people died as a result of the Soviet madness.
right. And in terms of the Stalin and Brezhnev, et cetera, later eras, tune
Right.
back in for lecture number 3 in our series, which will focus primarily on that.
Good.
A listener says the following: Anti-Zionists often discount Arab anti-Semitism as a reaction to the founding of the State of Israel and the alleged crimes against their Arab brethren by the Jews. How would you respond to that claim?
Well, look, I mean, it's characteristic cart before the horse. In other words, the hostility to the Jews was there from well before there was a state. Just the presence of autonomous Jews in what should be Dar al-Islam triggered these genocidal desires, as documented by Hajj Amin al-Husseini in 1937. If the Arabs had accepted the division of the country, which was greatly favorable to them and greatly unfavorable to the Jews, there wouldn't have been a displacement. There wouldn't have been anything to complain about. It's just, it is the technique of the Palestinian demopaths to claim that they're the victims when in fact they're the frustrated victimizers.
Can you just say a little bit about who Husseini was for those who may not be familiar with him?
Well, Hajj Amin al-Husseini was actually appointed by the first Jewish, I forget what governor of the
Herbert
Palestine
Samuel?
Mandate.
Samuel.
Um, what?
Herbert Samuel.
Herbert Samuel. And he appointed him mostly because, well, I won't go into the details of why he appointed him, but Hajj Amin al-Husseini was a ferocious hater. And first of all, he killed all the moderates like the Nashashibi clan. And he mobilized this ferocious hatred of the Jews with fake claims that they were planning to destroy the Dome of the Rock and so on, and triggering riots against Jews. And during the war, he spent 4 years in Berlin doing Arab language broadcasts for the Nazis and calling for the extermination of the Jews everywhere. So, he's about as bad as they get. He was a good friend of both Hitler and the the Nazi propagandists, and
So just to clarify, so he's the Palestinian Arab, religious and national leader from the 1920s into the
right,
1950s or so, right? So,
right,
and he,
who
if I've
never referred to himself as Palestinian.
uh, I'm using
He just
today's
happened
language,
to be he just happened to be appointed by the
right?
Palestinian Mandate.
Right. And so to understand your thesis here, he, as a representative and as a leader, has this horrific view of the Jews as the enemies of Islam going back to the 7th century. So this has
Right,
nothing to do with the Zionism or the state of Israel,
right,
and has this belief that Jews should essentially be subservient to Islamic sovereignty, and so cannot tolerate the idea of independent or autonomous Jews, but then uses the language, and this is the demopathy that you were saying, right, or the projection.
right,
So the more accurate rendition is that he, because of his hatred towards Jews, wants to suppress or get rid of or annihilate the Jews, continue the Nazi program. But he does this by delegitimizing the Jews and casting them as the imperialist, colonialist genociders.
right,
That's
right,
it.
which
All right.
is right, which is what the Nazis were doing.
So that's a segue to the next question, which is please address the pejorative label of colonist to Zionism.
Oh, so this is part of the magic whereby anti-Zionism adopts a secular version um, of the Great Lethal Projection. In other words, in post-colonial terminology, you know, colonial imperialism is the great sin of the West. They conveniently overlook the fact that some of the most ferocious and long-lasting colonial imperialists were the Arabs, the Arab Muslims who conquered, basically from India to the Atlantic Ocean. So on the one hand, they ignore the Muslim imperialist, colonialist tradition, and then they associate Israel with the Western one, even though Zionism was specifically an anti-imperialist movement and had a very strong critique of the Western imperialist tendencies. But at the same time, as they dismissed they dismissed Muslim imperialism and accused Israel of Western imperialism, they also were able to, how could I put this? They were able to insist that the Jews were doing, again, this is the projection, the Jews were guilty of their imperialism. The reason why there's a war in the Middle East today is with Israel is because the imperialist tradition of this triumphalist Islam, which is we can only feel good about ourselves if we dominate, if we rule the world or rule the area in which we're in which we are the dominant majority. Only under those circumstances are we comfortable with our infidel population, which has to be subject. And therefore, we accuse them of trying to do to us what we take as the norm for what we do to them.
Yeah, I think this concept of projection is very illuminating in lots of ways, and it goes very nicely with what I seem to notice and many others notice, the regular inversion, like when we talk about like literally inverting the truth, reversing victim and offender, reversing aggressor and perpetrator. And I go back to the Nazis who cast their entire campaign against the Jews as a defensive maneuver. Why? Because they believed in the protocol, so they believed the Jews, or at least they said they believed that the Jews were attempting to perpetrate domination and genocide against the Nazis. And so they were just defending themselves and defending the world against the Jews,
Right,
thereby reversing aggressor and defender, right? Because of course the Nazis are the aggressors there. And with your
right,
analysis, we're allowed to say they are projecting onto the Jews the desire for genocide, which is in fact their own desire. So inversion and reversal of victim and offender, et cetera, go very nicely, I think, with this projection lens that you're
yeah.
offering. We have a conversation beginning to brew in the Q&A. I think this goes back to the question from my student, which is how do today's progressives, how can we say that the protocols is influential when they've never heard of it or read it? And just person has
Right.
commented, it's the same as how students automatically know and easily embrace Marxist views of capitalism without knowing anything about Marxism, right? I think so. There's an interesting analogy there. Okay, we
Yep.
have another question. Shouldn't we be charitable towards some of the genocide believers? They do not take the time to come to their own take on the issue, but rather accept the purportedly expert opinions coming out of the human rights NGO community. So, A, is that an accurate description of their coming to these beliefs? And B, is that a justifiable defense?
Well, I think it explains it. I don't think it justifies it. I mean, I use the term for people who ignore the role of the protocols and the role of projection in the anti-Zionist discourse as being aggressively naive. In other words, or I refer to them in the paper as being principal dupes. It's like we cannot question the Palestinian narrative. It is, in some senses, sacred if they say that the Israelis target children and babies and snipe with babies and so on, then we're not in a position to call that into question. And that's certainly the way our legacy journalists like Jeremy Diamond and the whole crew at CNN or in the New York Times or you name it, NPR, the way they deal with Palestinian claims is unprincipled to accept them.
I think I remember you quoting, perhaps in your book, right? You'll have to remind me who the person was if you remember the name, but I think it was a UN official, right, saying something like this. It would be cruel not to believe the Palestinians, right? Do you remember that quote?
Yes, yes. And in fact,
Right.
that was one of the quotes that came from one of the people on the commission to investigate the terrible war crimes of the Israelis during Operation Cast Lead. And her comment was, it would be cruel to disbelieve their claims. Well, it's cruel to the Israelis to believe false claims about them. But that, it's interesting. PEN, the writers' organization that's supposedly dedicated to freedom, just came out with, they've kicked the Israelis out and they've brought in the Palestinian writers. And one of the interesting things about their statement was that, we must sympathize with people who are marginalized and I forget what they term the fragile and marginalized minorities. Well, they're not a minority. They're a billion plus people, and they're not marginalized. They're front and center in the discourse of the West. So there's something askew in the way that Westerners think about Muslims. And, this is a topic for another talk, but I think part of this is sheer intimidation. I think that Penn and our journalists and our NGOs are essentially performing the duties of a dhimmi. Dhimmi is the subject status within Islam. And they do this as a way of trying to preempt a more serious imposition of dhimmitude. So here they can be free, they can hold their positions of authority as, presidents of colleges and so on and so forth, as professors and so on. And they're free from fear of Muslim retaliation as long as they behave the way a dhimmi should behave, which means they cannot criticize Islam, they cannot question the claims of Islam, and if they want to show their bona fides, they side with Islam against Islam's enemies. And that's exactly how the anti-Zionists in the West behave. So I think a synonym for anti-Zionism, in addition to being a kind of dupe of the great lethal projection, is that they're also preemptive dhimmi. They're behaving like dhimmi so that they don't have to actually adopt that status.
So this is a perfect segue to the next question, which is what is your view of the explanatory memorandum relating to the Muslim Brotherhood plan for the West and its relationship to the protocols? Are you familiar with this document from the early 90s?
Sure. It actually goes back to a document that was written in 1979/1400 in Switzerland by exiles from the Arab world and the Muslim Brotherhood. And
And for
yes,
our
this is
listeners, this is a document which purports to lay out basically, think about the protocols, right? Which was the secret Jewish plan to take over the world. Well, this memorandum is basically laying out the Muslim Brotherhood plan to infiltrate and take over the West, right?
right,
Except
right.
it's a
And
genuine document.
and in 1994, echoing that document, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who probably is the most prominent, he's now passed away, the most prominent Muslim preacher, Muslim Brotherhood preacher, came to America, addressed Muslim youth, and said that the West will be conquered by dawah, which I translated as cognitive warfare. It literally means summons, that the West will be conquered by summons, by a verbal discourse that they will obey, not by jihad. But really, what's going on is you've got jihad as the tough cop and dawah as the nice cop. So jihad does terrible things like October 7th. And then the dawah moderates come in and say, look, if you don't want this to happen, this is how you should behave. And of course, how you should behave is behave like a dhimmi.
All right, so let's close with there's like a group of questions on the general theme of what do we do now? Like how do we respond to all of this? And I'll just simply say creating initiatives like the Institute for the Critical Study of
Yes,
Anti-Zionism is one way to do this because we need
right,
to turn critical scholarly eye on the ideology that has infiltrated the universities
right.
to allow this. So let me just put that plug in there. But we have people asking like, how do we deal with the K through 12 situation? Is it time for all Jews to just move to Israel? What do we do about teachers unions and college administrators? So putting those all
Right.
together, should we move to Israel? Is it over for Jews in the West or coming to that point? Or are there things that we can do now to reclaim our status and defend ourselves?
Well, look, if the Jews leave the West, more or less, I think the West is sunk. I mean, if they can't prevent the Muslims from kicking Jews out of their countries, then they can't defend themselves either. So, look, I think the battle is being fought anywhere, everywhere. It's being fought here in Israel. I'm near the northern border. If there's a war with Iran, Hezbollah has allegedly been trained to come down and attack us. So the war is going on everywhere. I say fight it the best you can. If it's the best you can do is to fight it where you are, then do so. And the way to do it is to patiently show people who believe this nonsense, not only that it's nonsense, but it's terribly hurtful, self-destructive nonsense. That it essentially it embraces the very people whose values the left allegedly despises. Um, and it means showing courage, and it means getting other people to show the courage to stand up to this nice cop, tough cop intimidation of the West by the caliphators. So, look, I mean, there's a lot to be done. There are things like we've got to go after the term Islamophobia. It's a paralytic. Every time you criticize a Muslim, like the mayor of London or the mayor of New York, he will immediately accuse you of Islamophobia. And the fact that that accusation can actually paralyze people, lose their jobs, is just staggering in my mind. I mean, it comes right after 9/11. And right after 9/11, anybody who started to denounce this strain of Islam got accused of Islamophobia. So it's literally a kind of suicidal virtue signaling to think that you are showing what a good person you are by siding with genocidal maniacs.
So we will go 2 more minutes as we approach our end here. I'm honored and flattered to see that Daniel Pipes has weighed in, who you happen to have quoted a little bit earlier in your talk, who says some
Uh-huh.
complimentary things, but offers a small but important disagreement. So long as Jews accepted the dhimmi status, he says, Muslims did not have genocidal intentions. Those arose with the emergence of Zionism. So I just put that out there. You can comment on that. And then I'd love for you to close if you can. Someone asked a question. Let me go find it. I don't know if you read Brett Stevens' recent editorial, but it's coming out like what should in terms of fighting this problem, should we stop fighting anti-Semitism and just turn towards Jewish pride, or should we focus on anti-Zionism as a separate thing from anti-Semitism? So if you could close with a comment on that, I think that would be a great place to stop.
Okay, so in response to Dan's piece, I think that Islam in general has, as a reflex to a challenge to its dominion, a genocidal impulse. In fact, there's a famous study of Montenegro and the Christian tribes there and their, it's called Blood Revenge by Christopher Boehm, Boehm. And one of the things he says is that as a self-protective element, these communities never allowed a sort of monarchical figure to emerge because if they did, being as they were in Muslim territory, they would bring down a genocidal reaction on them. And that's what happened to the Armenians in the 1910s. So this it's true that Zionism triggered that anxiety, that horror at the thought of an autonomous Jewish presence, an autonomous infidel presence in what should be Dar al-Islam. But as I think Andrew Bostom has shown, it goes way back. This is not sort of brand new with Zionism. It's a typical reaction to a loss of control.
So with
Now,
that, let's
as
maybe
for
stop. Uh,
what?
we could stop there, I think, because we're a couple minutes over now. So we'll save that thought. I just want to remind people that these questions actually will be sent to Professor Landis. So there's a chance he might be able to get back to you. Do mark your calendars. We have a couple more talks coming up. So if you registered for this one, you should be on the list to get the next couple of talks in the series. And Simon, do you want to close things off?
Yes, thank you, Professor Landis and Professor Andrew Pessin. Reiterating that this lecture has been recorded and will be sent to your email along with a resource guide with the scholar's contact information in a few days. Please consider a donation to support our free lectures at chaymitzvah.org. So our next Scholar Circle lecture is part 2 of the 6-part series featuring Professor Jeffrey Herf on secular and religious forms of antagonism of Israel, Nazis, Soviets, Islamists on Tuesday, March 10th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Richard.